In the late summer of 1883, a woman stepped off a Northern Pacific train onto the platform at Miles City, Montana Territory, carrying a carpet bag in each hand and a very particular understanding of where she was going. She had a description of a house. She had read that description several times across the long days of rail travel from Cincinnati, and she had let herself imagine it with the kind of careful restraint that a sensible woman applies to things she cannot yet verify. A parlor, a wood floor, a kitchen with a cast-iron stove already set and level. She had read those words in a letter written in a plain, unhurried hand, and she had taken them at face value, because a woman answering a matrimonial advertisement in 1883 had to take something at face value, or she would never leave home at all. What she found at the end of the depot platform was a man named Dean Murray, holding a lantern in one hand and his hat in the other, standing in the August dark with the particular stillness of a person who has prepared several things to say and decided against all of them. Behind him, 12 miles out on the open grass, was a canvas tent, a dug foundation, and 320 acres of promise that had not yet been redeemed. That was the gap between the letter and the lantern. It was a considerable gap. And what happened inside it, across the next months and then the next decades, is the whole of the story. Dean had filed on his 320 acres in the spring of that year, when the ground along the Tongue River Valley was still iron cold, but the sky had begun to run long and pale in the evenings, the way Montana skies do when winter has finally decided to withdraw. He was 31 years old, a man of moderate height and immoderate patience, who had come west from a small farm in western Illinois 5 years earlier, with nothing particular to recommend him except that he did not quit. He had worked 2 seasons at a cattle outfit outside Billings, saved what the outfit's bookkeeper called an insufficient amount, and spent the 3rd season deciding which ground to file on. The 320 acres he chose sat in a gentle fold of the Tongue River country, sheltered from the north by a long ridge of ponderosa pine, and open to the south, where the grass ran unbroken for a distance that made a man feel, depending on his temperament, either very free or very small. Dean felt free. He was that kind of man. He broke ground for the root cellar in April and began the foundation in May, working with a borrowed pick and a mule named Clem, who had a talent for moving earth and no interest in being thanked for it. Clem was a red-brown animal with one ear that stood straight and one that tilted forward at a permanent angle of mild inquiry, and he pulled and hauled without complaint in exchange for grain and the occasional strip of dried apple, which Dean kept in his coat pocket as a kind of currency. The two of them excavated the better part of the foundation in 6 weeks, and Dean had intended to have the first log course set by midsummer. The log course was not set by midsummer. There were reasons for this. The pines on the ridge had to be felled and trimmed and dragged down to the building site, which was slower work than Dean had calculated. The root cellar, once opened, revealed a seam of clay that needed shoring before anything could be built above it. A late spring storm took the tent down twice and required restaking on both occasions. By the time June gave way to July, Dean had a sound root cellar, a clean foundation, 24 trimmed logs laid in a yard, and a very clear picture of how much remained. He sat with that picture for several evenings before he wrote his second letter to the matrimonial agency in Cincinnati. The agency was a respectable operation called the Western Placement Bureau, which placed women seeking frontier husbands and men seeking capable wives with the brisk efficiency of a firm that understood both parties were making a practical decision and preferred not to have that fact treated sentimentally. Dean had written his first letter in March, before the filing was complete, describing his land and intentions in plain terms. He had received in return a brief note from the Bureau, and then a longer letter from a woman named Hazel Voss of Dayton, Ohio, who was 27 years old, unmarried, and described herself with a directness he found immediately appealing. She could cook, she wrote, though not elaborately. She could keep accounts. She had been a teacher's assistant for 4 years before her family's circumstances changed, and she had found herself in a position where the frontier, which she had never considered, began to seem more sensible than the available alternatives. Dean wrote back. They exchanged 3 more letters through the spring and into early summer, and in the last of these Dean described the house with a specificity he had not quite earned. He wrote about the parlor as though its walls were already standing. He wrote about the kitchen stove with the confidence of a man who had ordered one and not yet received it. He did not, strictly speaking, lie. He wrote about what the house would be, and he used a verb tense that declined to announce the distinction. He told himself this was practical, that the house would certainly be built before she arrived, that he was simply describing the near future with appropriate certainty. The stove arrived from Miles City in late July, and it was level by August. The walls were not there to put it in. Hazel arrived on the 20th of August. Dean had ridden Clem into Miles City the day before and arranged for a room at the hotel, which he intended to explain as a courtesy for her first night in the territory. He had not yet worked out how to explain the subsequent nights. He stood on the platform in the dark, lantern in hand, and watched the train pull in with the measured breath of a man who has decided that honesty offered now is better than honesty forced out later by circumstances. She came down the steps in a gray traveling dress with her 2 carpetbags and looked at him with eyes that were dark and level, the kind of eyes that had been taking the measure of situations since childhood and had grown comfortable doing it without commentary. She said, "Mr. Murray," and he said, "Miss Voss." And then he said, "I want to tell you something before we go any further." She set 1 carpetbag down and waited. He told her about the tent. He told her about the foundation. He told her that the stove was level and the root cellar was sound, and that he had 3 dozen logs in the yard and intended to have 4 walls up before the first frost, which was 6 to 8 weeks off if the season ran typical. He said all of this without embellishment, and when he finished he was quiet, and she was quiet, and the lantern swayed slightly in the late summer air. "How far to the claim?" she said. 12 miles. "Is the tent dry?" "It is." She picked up the second carpetbag. "Then let's not stand here," she said. She had not decided to stay, not in any final way. What she had decided, on the ride out from Miles City with Clem plodding steadily beneath the stars, and Dean riding his horse alongside and not filling the dark with unnecessary words, was that the man had told her the truth when the truth cost him something. That was more than she had expected, and it was enough to purchase the next morning. The morning after that, she would assess on its own terms. The tent was dry. The cot inside it had a wool blanket that smelled of cedar and was folded with a precision that told her something about the man who had put it there. The lantern hook was at the right height. A small crate beside the cot held a candle and a box of matches and a tin cup. None of these things were elegant, but all of them were placed where they needed to be. And that told her something too. She sat on the cot in the candlelight and looked through the open tent flap at the foundation hole in the moonlight. That rectangular darkness cut into the Montana grass. And she thought about the letters. She had known, reading them, that something was smoothed over. She was not a woman who read without attention, and the verb tenses had not escaped her. She had come anyway, which was its own kind of answer to a question she had not wanted to put directly to herself. She blew out the candle and lay down and listened to the grass move. If you have ever watched 2 people circle a truth they are not quite ready to name, you know that the circling has its own texture and its own pace, and that you cannot hurry it. Leave a comment below about a time when someone showed you their character plainly, and you chose to trust what you saw. There are more stories like this one, waiting at the end. In the weeks that followed, the circling settled into work, which is the most honest thing two people on the frontier can do together. Dean felled timber. Hazel peeled bark, which was not a task he had assigned her and not a task she had announced she would do. She simply picked up the draw knife one morning and began, and the pile of peeled logs grew with a steadiness that made Dean reset his timeline in his head without saying so. She was not particularly strong, but she was methodical, and she did not stop when the work was unpleasant, which on the frontier is the quality that matters. She cooked over an open fire on a stone ring Dean had set near the tent, and the food she made was plain but consistently edible, which is a higher standard than it sounds in a season when the nearest supply of anything is 12 miles away. She kept track of what they had in the root cellar and what they needed, and she wrote the figures in a small notebook with a pencil she sharpened on a flat stone. And when she told Dean they were short on flour by her estimate for the coming month, she was right by 3 pounds. Dean watched her and said very little, which was his natural register, and what he felt watching her was a kind of recalibration that he did not have the vocabulary to name and would not have used even if he had. He had expected someone who needed managing. He had not expected someone who managed things without requiring that anyone notice. Ora Prentice rode over from the next claim in the second week of September. Ora was a widow of 53 who had homesteaded her own ground after her husband died of a kicked rib in 1879, and who had since developed a settled view of what the frontier asked of people and what it gave back to those who could not meet the ask. She was not cruel in her assessments, but she was not soft either. She sat her horse at the edge of the building site, looked at the foundation and the tent and the stack of logs, looked at Hazel peeling a length of pine with the draw knife, and said to Dean, loud enough for Hazel to hear without trouble, "She won't last to frost." Dean said nothing. Hazel kept the draw knife moving. "No offense meant," Ora said, which was the thing people said when they meant some offense, though not a malicious one. "She's a town girl. Town girls don't last the first winter." "She's from Ohio," Dean said. "That's what I said," said Ora. She rode back to her own claim without dismounting, and the sound of her horse faded into the grass, and Hazel set the draw knife down and looked at the length of log she'd been working and said, without looking at Dean, "Does she wager?" "Roy Tibbs wagers," Dean said. "Ora just talks." "Who is Roy Tibbs?" "Feed supplier. Runs the dry goods counter in town." Hazel picked up the draw knife again. "How much does he have on me?" she said. Dean was quiet for a moment. "He hasn't said a number out loud," he said, "but he has an opinion." She made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was something in the neighborhood of one, and went back to the log, and Dean went back to his felling, and that was the whole conversation. But something had shifted in it, a small easement, like a door opened an inch where it had been closed. Roy Tibbs ran the feed and dry goods counter at the south end of Miles City's main commercial street, a narrow fronted building with a porch that sagged on the left side and had been sagging for 2 years without anyone fixing it. He was a man of 40-odd years with a talent for reading which way a situation was tilting and placing his certainty accordingly, and his certainty about Hazel was considerable. He had seen mail-order brides come through Miles City in ones and twos over the years, and his record on predicting their tenure was, in his own telling, quite good. He told anyone who came to the counter in the fall of 1883 that Dean Murray's bride would be on the eastbound train before the grass turned brown. Hazel was not on the eastbound train. She was, in late September, standing on top of the first completed log course of the house's north wall, steadying a timber while Dean notched it into place, which required holding her weight against it for longer than was comfortable, and which she did without complaint and without particular drama. The wall rose a course at a time through the first week of October, and by the second week they had 3 walls at chest height and the 4th begun. The nights had begun to bite by then, the way Montana nights do in October when autumn has finished its argument with summer and settled the question. Hazel had moved her cot into the root cellar for warmth, which was not comfortable but was considerably better than the tent, and she had hung a piece of canvas over the cellar entrance to keep the wind from coming straight down. Dean had offered her the tent and slept in the cellar himself, and she had declined and taken the cellar on the grounds that it was warmer, and they had argued about this in the plain-spoken and practical way of 2 people who have ceased pretending they are not necessary to each other. The stove was still outside, set on a flat stone near the building site, because the kitchen floor was not yet laid. They ate their meals at a plank set across 2 sawhorses, and in the evenings Dean lit the lantern and they sat on opposite sides of the plank, and sometimes she read from one of the 3 books she had brought in her carpetbags, and sometimes he sharpened tools, and sometimes they talked about the work that remained and the weather that was coming. And once, on a Thursday evening in early October, she asked him why he had come west in the first place. He thought about it for longer than she expected. He said he had not been especially good at the life he had back in Illinois. Not bad at it, just not suited. He said the frontier suited him in the way that a particular shape of work suits a particular shape of hand. He said it without sentiment, and she listened without comment. And when he finished, she said, "That's what your letters didn't say." "No," he said. "They were good letters," she said, "except for the house." "I know it." "I didn't come for the house," she said. He looked at her across the plank. He said, "What did you come for?" She thought about it. "I came for a reason to be useful," she said. The house was besides the point. He was quiet for a long time after that. Not uncomfortable quiet, but the kind of quiet a man settles into when something has been said that he needs to turn over carefully before he responds. And by the time he might have responded, she had opened her book again, and the lantern burned between them and the Montana dark pressed against the tent walls. And outside Clem moved in the makeshift pen and made the low, ruminative sound he made when he was content. And the night was cold. It was the 3rd week of November when Dean's cough turned wrong. He had been coughing since the 2nd week of October, the way men who work outdoors in cold weather cough, the dry, persistent kind that comes from breathing cold air all day, and is not alarming unless it deepens. It deepened on a Wednesday. By Thursday evening it had settled into his chest in the way that lung fever settles, which is to say it stopped being a cough and became a presence, something with weight and intention. He was feverish by nightfall, sweating through the wool blanket in a way that made Hazel put her hand to his forehead and then stand very still for a moment before she said anything. She said, "I need to know where the nearest doctor is." Dean, from under the blanket, said, "Miles City, Dr. Aldrin." 12 miles, she said. "In the morning I'll be better," he said. And he believed this, and she did not argue with him because the argument would have cost time, and she had already decided. She was up before first light. She built the fire outside and heated water and made him drink it, and she checked the root cellar provisions and set out what he would need within reach if he could reach anything. And then she went to the pen and saddled Clem with Dean's saddle, which was heavier than she would have chosen, and led him out to the mounting block Dean had cut from a stump. The sleet started before she had ridden 2 miles. It came in from the northwest at an angle, not heavy but steady and cold, the kind of sleet that gets into the gap between a hat brim and a collar and finds the skin directly. The track to Miles City ran across open ground for most of its length, and the wind had full access to it. and Clem put his ears flat and leaned into the weather with the resignation of an animal that has learned the weather is not negotiable. He did not slow. That was the thing about Clem that Hazel would remember for the rest of her life. He did not slow. She could not feel her fingers by the 4th mile. She tucked her hands into the reins and kept them moving by opening and closing them against the leather at intervals, the way she had read once that you were supposed to manage frost, in a almanac she had consulted years ago for reasons she could not now recall. By the 6th mile, she could not feel her feet in the stirrups. She did not stop to think about her feet. She thought about the 12 miles as a series of smaller distances, the way you manage a task that is larger than comfortable, by refusing to hold the whole of it in your mind at once. Clem brought her into Miles City in just over 3 hours. She found Dr. Aldrin's house on the 2nd Street back from the main, a white-painted frame building with a lamp already lit in the front window, because the doctor kept early hours and was, as it happened, already at his breakfast. She tied Clem to the post and went up the steps and knocked, and when the doctor opened the door and looked at her standing there in the sleet with her hat soaked through and her hands stiff at her sides, he said, "Come in." Before she said a word, she told him in plain sentences what Dean's symptoms were, the timeline, the nature of the cough, the fever's temperature as best she could estimate it, and the doctor listened and asked 2 questions and then said, "Lung fever. I'll come." He was saddled and out of the barn in 20 minutes. Hazel drank the cup of tea his housekeeper pressed into her hands and stamped her feet on the kitchen floor until she could feel them, and then she went back out to Clem and turned him around. The ride back was slower because the sleet had thickened and the doctor's horse was less committed to the pace than Clem, and it was mid-morning by the time they reached the claim. Dean was worse than she had left him. The doctor went in, examined him, confirmed what she had told him, and then said to Hazel in the plain terms of frontier medicine in 1883 that there was nothing he could give him that rest and nursing would not do better. He left a small packet of willow bark powder and instructions on keeping the fever managed, and he rode back toward Miles City with a nod to Hazel that carried more respect than his words had bothered to articulate. The 9 days that followed were the longest 9 days of Hazel's life, and she was not a woman prone to dramatic accounting. Dean ran the fever hard for the first 4 days, the kind of fever that makes a man say things that do not correspond to the present situation, that reaches back into the past and brings out pieces of it without context. He said his father's name several times. He said something once about a creek that had flooded in Illinois. Hazel did not try to follow these dispatches. She kept the willow bark tea coming, kept the fire built to the right heat, kept the wool blankets dry by rotating them with the 2 spares she found in the root cellar, and she slept when he slept, which wasn't often enough. Ora Prentice appeared on the 5th day. She came without announcement, as frontier neighbors did, and she came with a cast-iron pot of beef broth tied to her saddle with a length of rope, and she tied her horse at the pen post and walked in and set the pot on the outdoor stove without asking whether the pot was wanted. She looked at Dean under the blankets and looked at Hazel, who was gray-faced and standing very straight, and said, "You look like you need an hour of sleep." "I'm all right," Hazel said. "An hour," Ora said. "I'll watch him." Hazel slept for 2 hours on the cot in the root cellar, which was the deepest sleep she had slept since the fever started. And when she came back up, Ora was seated beside Dean with her hands in her lap and the broth warming on the stove, and she said nothing about the 2 hours versus 1, and Hazel said nothing about it either. Ora came back on the 7th day with more broth and a pan of cornbread, and stayed 3 hours, and on neither visit did she say anything about frost or town girls or the eastbound train. Some assessments, once proven wrong by the plain evidence of what a person has actually done, deserved no ceremony. The revision was visible in the way she handed Hazel the cornbread, in the way she did not try to instruct her. Dean's fever broke on the 9th day, a Thursday morning, in a long, cold sweat that soaked through the blanket and left him looking wrung out and bewildered, the way a person looks who has been somewhere else for a while and is not quite sure what they missed. He lay still for a time, and then he said, with the dry scrape of a voice that had been through something, "How long?" 9 days, Hazel said. He looked at the ceiling. He said, "The walls." 2 courses on the west wall since you went down, she said. I did what I could reach. The upper courses need you. He looked at her. She was sitting on the camp stool beside him, and she looked like a woman who had ridden 12 miles through sleet on a mule, and then nursed a man through 9 days of lung fever, because that was what she was. And she was not trying to look like anything else. He opened his mouth and then closed it, because there was nothing he could say that was adequate to the fact of her. And he was a man who knew the difference between adequate and inadequate. "Thank you," he said. "You would have done the same," she said. He thought about that. He thought she was right. And he also thought that the statement contained more than it said, and that what it contained was worth paying attention to. And he did. He was on his feet, carefully, by the end of the week. He was back at the walls in the first days of December, which was later than he had intended, and colder than he would have chosen. But the logs were trimmed and the notches were cut, and the work went faster than it had in the fall, because they had learned each other's pace by then, and there was no time lost to uncertainty about what the other person would do next. The west wall rose. The roof poles went up. The shake roof was not finished, but the heavy canvas across the poles was enough for the immediate question of winter, and the stove moved inside at last, threw heat against the log walls and made the space livable in the way that matters, which is to say it was warm. The circuit preacher, a man named Fletcher, who rode a loop through the Tongue River country every 4 to 6 weeks, and was one of those men the frontier produces who can marry people and say words over graves and fix a wagon axle, and does not consider any of these tasks more sacred than the others, arrived on a Wednesday afternoon in the 2nd week of December, with snow on his hat brim and his horse's breath making clouds in the cold air. He had a letter Dean had sent him from Miles City in November, before the fever, and he had made the claim his first stop on this loop. Ora Prentice had ridden over that morning as though she had known he was coming, which she probably had, because news moved across the Tongue River Valley by the route that news has always moved in sparsely settled places, which is to say along every track and through every conversation until it is no longer news. She stood to one side of the newly built fireplace in her good coat and held the lantern while Fletcher said the words, and Dean and Hazel stood on the new board floor of the house and listened, and then said the things you say on such occasions, and Fletcher signed the paper he carried for the purpose and dated it the 14th of December, 1883. Afterward, Ora produced a jar of preserved plums from her coat pocket, which was the kind of extravagance a woman allows herself when an occasion demands it, and they ate the plums standing up because there was not yet a proper table. And Fletcher told a story about a wedding he had conducted in a blizzard outside Glendive, where the ring had gone into a snowdrift and they had spent 20 minutes looking for it, and Dean poured whiskey from a bottle he had been saving since October, and the stove made it sound, and outside the snow came down clean, and even on the 320 acres. Roy Tibbs did not have the grace to look uncomfortable the following spring when Dean walked into the feed and dry goods counter and settled his account in full, $14.60, owed for the season's supplies, paid in coin on the wooden counter. Tibbs counted it twice, which was his habit, and wrote the receipt, which was also his habit, and said, "I hear the house is coming along." "It is," Dean said. That was the whole of it. No speech was made. No accounting of the wager was required. because the wager's terms had been settled by something more persuasive than words, which was the continued and undeniable presence of Hazel Murray on the claim through the whole of the winter that Roy Tibbs had been so certain she would not last. Dean put the receipt in his coat pocket and went out to where Clem was tied at the post and rode back toward home. And if he smiled on the ride, there was no one out there on the open grass to see it but the mule, who had a long memory and a short interest in other people's satisfactions. The house was finished in the spring of 1884. The parlor had a wood floor. The kitchen had the cast-iron stove, level and black and thoroughly itself. There was no parlor organ because a parlor organ was not within the range of what the ranch could afford that year. But Hazel had brought from Ohio a small shelf of books, 7 volumes in good condition, and Dean built a shelf for them out of pine boards and ran a length of carved rope pattern along the top edge, which served no structural function whatsoever, and was the first unnecessary thing he had made since arriving in Montana Territory. And she ran her fingers along it the morning he put it up without saying anything, which was the only comment that was needed. The ranch grew in the way that ranches grow on the Montana grasslands when the man running it is patient and doesn't overextend, which is to say slowly and then all at once. Dean added cattle in 1885, a modest beginning of 40 head bought from a drover coming through Miles City, and by 1889, when Montana came into the Union as the 41st state, he was running 160 head on the 320 acres and had fenced the northern boundary along the ridge where the pines grew. Hazel kept the accounts in a ledger she maintained with the same pencil-sharpening precision she had applied to the notebook in the tent, and the figures in the ledger told a story of ground held and debt steadily reduced, and a household that spent less than it earned by a careful margin every year. They had 3 children. The first came in 1885, a daughter they named Clara, who grew up with her father's patience and her mother's attention to numbers and eventually taught school in Miles City for 22 years, which was longer than Hazel had been a teacher's assistant, and which Hazel noted in the ledger margin with a single dry notation that said simply, "She surpassed us." The second child, a son named Thomas, was born in 1887, and he took over the ranch management when he was old enough to do it competently, and ran it through the lean years of the 1890s with a steadiness that owed something to watching his father work, and something else to watching his mother refuse to panic at bad numbers. The third, another son named George, was born in 1890 and left the Tongue River Valley in 1908 to study law in Missoula, which was the kind of outcome the frontier produces occasionally from the children of people who built bookshelves with carved edges. Dean died in the autumn of 1911 of a second lung fever that came on in October and did not yield the way the first one had. He was 59 years old. He died in the bed in the house he had built, in the room with the wood floor and the shelf of books. And Hazel was beside him for all of it, the way she had been beside him for the first fever, and the way she had, in the larger sense, been beside him for the whole of what passed between those 2 occasions. They buried him on the hillside above the ranch, in the place they had agreed upon years earlier, on an evening walk when the grass was long and the light was going gold, the place where you could see the whole of the 320 acres laid out below and the ridge of pines along the north boundary and, on clear days, a long blue distance of mountains to the south. Clara and Thomas and George were there. Ora Prentice was there, older now and slower in the saddle, but still on her own ground, still keeping her own account. Fletcher had died in 1901, and another circuit man said the words. Hazel lived 13 more years after Dean. She kept the house. She kept the ledger. She walked up to the hillside grave on Sunday mornings, when the weather allowed it, and sat for a time in the way of a person who has things to say to someone who is not present to hear them, but who is, in some accounting, she did not require anyone else to understand. still listening. Thomas ran the ranch through her remaining years and consulted her on any figure larger than $100, not because she required it, but because he knew the figures were safer in her hands than in his alone. She died in the spring of 1924, quietly and at home, at the age of 68. They buried her on the hillside beside Dean, in the ground above the ranch that had been, in the August of 1883, a canvas tent and a hole, and a man holding a lantern. The house stood. The shelf of books was still on the wall of the parlor, the carved rope edge still running along its top. A small, unnecessary grace note in a house built otherwise entirely of necessary things. The stove was still level in the kitchen. The root cellar, dug by one man and a mule in the spring of that long-ago year, was still sound below the floor. Clem had died in the winter of 1897, at an age no one had precisely reckoned, and Thomas had buried him in the pasture below the ridge. Hazel had put a note in the margin of the 1897 ledger. Clem, the old mule, carried us both. She had not elaborated because the ledger was not the place for elaboration, and because some things do not require it. You carry a thing 12 miles through sleet in the dark, and the thing you carried you on is owed more than a margin note. But a margin note is what there is, and it turns out to be enough. And the ranch went on, and the grass grew, and the pines held the ridge against the north wind the way they always had, patient as the mule, indifferent to any verdict but the one the seasons kept rendering, year after year, on everyone who had ever tried to make something lasting out of the cold and the open and the work. If this story stayed with you, leave a word below about what moved you most. And if you want another story like this one, the next one is waiting just ahead.